The door slams shut. A girl no older than 14 is pushed into a room reeking of sweat wine and unwashed bodies. Outside the streets of Athens hum with the voices of philosophers and politicians praising liberty and virtue. Inside she belongs to the brothel now. She will never see the sun without permission again. This is the other Athens. Not the one of marble columns and grand speeches, but the one built on the silent misery of women bought and sold like clay pots. They were called porne slaves, whose only purpose was to be rented out sometimes for a few coins, sometimes for the price of bread. And the city needed them. The same men who debated justice in the agora would come here at night, their sandals leaving dusty prints on the brothel floor. The taxes on these women's bodies filled the city's treasury. Their suffering oiled the machine of Athens' so-called golden age. History rarely speaks of them. Their names were not carved into stone, only scratched into the memories of men who forgot them by morning. Yet without these women, without this invisible economy, the Athens we celebrate in textbooks would not have existed in the same way. Today we tear away the golden mask. We will walk into the brothels, smell the air, hear the voices, and understand the price paid by those who could not refuse. Because the truth is this: the freedom Athens is famous for was never meant for everyone. And for thousands of women, the golden age was nothing more than a cage gilded in lies. The first thing you notice is the smell. Not the perfume of temples or the salty wind from Piraeus, but the heavy mix of unwashed skin oil lamps and sour wine. In the cramped room, women sit in silence, waiting. They are the porne slaves whose lives are measured in transactions. They come from everywhere. Thracian girls, captured in war, Anatolian teenagers, sold by desperate families, and even a few Athenian daughters discarded by fathers who found them useless to the household. Their skin tones, accents, and features differ, but here none of that matters. They are property. Prices vary. A few coins might buy you minutes with a girl who has been here for years, her body worn down by dozens of men a day. The youngest newly arrived could fetch the price of a fine dinner in the agora. In the poorest districts, a loaf of bread could be enough to take a woman upstairs. For the wealthy, there were more refined establishments, rooms decorated with painted walls and cushioned couches, but the rules were the same. These women could not say no. Their lives revolve around the needs of strangers. At dawn, they wash quickly with cold water, if water is even available, before being ordered to stand by the entrance, displaying themselves like pottery at the market. By night, they are drained, their voices hoarse, their eyes avoiding the gaze of other women. And yet, even in this world, there is a hierarchy. The lowest-ranked women endure the most brutality. Others favored by a steady client or a lenient madam might find brief moments of rest. But freedom, that is a myth. The city's laws treat them as nothing more than a taxable asset, and the taxes they generate are as regular as the sunrise. Athens poets wrote about beauty and desire, but here in the brothels, there is nothing romantic, only a trade in human bodies where flesh is just another commodity, and dignity is the first thing stripped away. Athens did not just tolerate prostitution, it regulated and monetized it. The city's leaders understood that desire could be turned into revenue, and they built an entire bureaucratic structure to ensure every coin was collected. It began with Solon's reforms centuries before the Golden Age. This revered lawmaker, praised for his wisdom, was also credited with opening the first state-run brothels. The justification was wrapped in morality. By offering cheap access to sex, men, especially young and unmarried, would be less tempted to commit adultery or pursue more dangerous passions. But behind this moral pretense was a simple truth. Prostitution was a business, and the state wanted its share. Every brothel was registered, every porn counted like livestock. Taxes were imposed not just on the establishments, but also on the individual women. Some historians believe these sex taxes contributed directly to funding public works, possibly even parts of the Parthenon itself. In other words, The very stones of Athens' most sacred monument might have been laid with silver, earned from the bodies of enslaved women. Inspectors, often chosen from the city's lesser magistrates, made unannounced visits. Their job was not to ensure humane treatment, such a concept barely existed in this context, but to verify that the correct number of women were available and that the taxes matched the earnings. If a brothel owner was caught hiding profits, the punishment was severe, heavy fines, confiscation of property, even public shaming in the agora. The law saw these women purely as economic units. Their suffering was irrelevant unless it threatened revenue. If one fell ill or became disfigured, she was simply replaced. The city's profit machine was relentless, and it fed on a steady supply of new bodies, usually from the slave markets or spoils of war. In Athens' official records, these transactions were neatly tallied, a cold ledger of flesh and silver. Yet behind every number was a human being whose life had been reduced to a taxable commodity, proof that even in the birthplace of democracy, freedom had limits defined by gender status and the city's appetite for wealth. If the porn were the cogs in Athens' profit machine, the hetairai were its dazzling, dangerous illusions. These were not women huddled in the dark corners of state brothels. They moved through marble halls lit by oil lamps, their laughter mingling with the debates of philosophers and generals. To the untrained eye, they appeared free, self-possessed, educated, even influential. But this freedom was a delicate performance, maintained at a staggering cost. The hetairai were more than bedmates. They were conversationalists who could quote poetry, challenge political arguments, and flatter a man's ego as skillfully as they poured his wine. In a city where most wives were confined to the gynekaion, hidden from public life, hetairai stepped boldly into the spaces where power was made. They attended symposia, exclusive drinking parties where alliances were forged, reputations ruined, and secrets whispered under the haze of wine. But this visibility came with strings. Every gesture, every word had to be calculated. One wrong move could mean exile from elite circles and a return to obscurity, or worse. Behind their painted smiles, many lived in constant tension, aware that their acceptance depended entirely on the whims of powerful men. A patron's favor could raise them to luxury. His anger could plunge them back into poverty overnight. Some became legendary, like Aspasia of Miletus, whose intellect and charm captivated Pericles himself. She was whispered to be the true mind behind some of Athens' most eloquent speeches. Yet even Aspasia was not immune to scandal. Accusations of impiety, political meddling, and moral corruption shadowed her, a reminder that no hetera could ever truly escape her precarious station. The paradox of the hetairai was that they embodied both the possibility of influence and the certainty of vulnerability. They were courted in public, but judged in private, celebrated for their wit, but condemned for the very independence that made them valuable. In the end, their power was not their own, it was borrowed, and it could be reclaimed without warning. The elegance of the hetairai and the raw survival of the porn shared a common root: chains. In Athens, the vast majority of women in the sex trade were not born in the city, nor were they free. They were slaves torn from their homelands in the chaos of war, victims of piracy, or children sold by desperate families into a system that saw them as living merchandise. Markets along the Piraeus port bustled not just with grain and pottery, but with human beings. Captives were displayed like wares, prodded, inspected, and priced according to youth, beauty, and perceived exotic value. A girl from Thrace might be valued for her fair hair, a woman from Anatolia for her foreign accent, a child for the ease with which she could be molded into obedience. Once purchased, there was no appeal, no trial, no recourse, only a transfer of ownership. From there, many were sent directly to brothels, where they became investments to be maximized. The state, as pragmatic as it was ruthless, understood that these women's bodies could fill the coffers of the city as effectively as taxes or tribute. And so the machinery turned each customer's coin, fed both the owner's purse and the Athenian economy. Slavery stripped these women not just of freedom, but of identity. Their names were often replaced by nicknames or crude labels tied to their place of origin. Their language was a commodity, sometimes trained to mimic the refinement of a hetairai, other times left untouched to emphasize their foreign allure. Everything about them was calculated to fit a market demand. For the free men of Athens, this was an invisible chain. They could pretend these women were willing, even eager. The reality was far uglier. They were captives in a city that had rewritten their existence, turning them into instruments of pleasure and profit. The comfort of the customer was built on the absence of the captive's choice. Step through the low door of an Athenian brothel and the air changes. It is thick with the mingled scents of oil lamps, cheap perfume, and bodies too close together for too long. The walls are narrow, the rooms smaller, still bare spaces, with little more than a bed, a jug of water, and whatever props were needed to sell an illusion. To the untrained eye, this might seem like a place of choice. Women reclining, laughing, with customers pouring wine, offering practiced glances of interest. But beneath that thin varnish was control, precise and relentless. The madam or owner, often a former sex worker herself or a shrewd businessman, dictated everything: who worked with which client, how long they stayed, and even the emotional tone of the interaction. This was the theater of consent, where every smile was rehearsed, every touch a transaction, and every refusal calculated not on desire, but on whether it would cost more than it earned. The women learned quickly that performance was survival. A sullen expression could mean fewer customers, which in turn meant harsher treatment, less food, or punishment. The brothel was also a cage of routine. Mornings might be spent preparing, washing, oiling, skin, styling hair to appeal to the tastes of the day. Afternoons brought the slow creep of customers, and nights often blurred into one another, each encounter leaving behind only coins and the faint bruises of ownership. Outside, Athens celebrated its democracy, philosophy, and art. Inside these rooms, another reality thrived, one where the freedom of some depended on the captivity of others. The city's intellectual elite might debate ethics in the agora, then step into the Piraeus quarter to spend the night with a woman who had no say in her fate. It was here in these dim-lit rooms that the contrast between Athens' golden reputation and its shadow economy was most stark. Beauty and pleasure were for sale, but the cost was paid entirely by those who could never leave. The brothel walls did not only trap the women, they also trapped the sickness. In the humid, airless rooms, the exchange of bodies meant the exchange of more than pleasure and coins. Disease was an unspoken but constant companion. Skin rashes that would not fade, sores that burned under the touch, a fever that stole strength one day and returned with vengeance the next. Athens had no true medicine for these afflictions. Only remedies passed from hand to hand, infusions of bitter herbs, oils meant to soothe but never cure. Once a woman's health began to fail, her value to the brothel owner plummeted. Sometimes she was sent to the streets to work for scraps. Sometimes she simply vanished, her name lost in the city's endless noise. But the wounds were not just physical. Stigma was another disease harder to cure. In the same breath, an Athenian man could praise a woman's beauty in private and publicly condemn her profession as corrupting the city's morals. Respectable wives and daughters could walk the streets without fear, but these women, whether in silk or rags, were marked as unworthy of honor, trust, or compassion. The cruelest part was how silence made the suffering invisible. No public debate addressed their health. No philosopher's treatise argued for their dignity. The city's celebrated theaters staged tragedies about kings and warriors, but never about the women who fought their battles in narrow beds behind closed doors. And yet they endured. Some developed secret sisterhoods, sharing food, medicine, or even customers when one fell too ill to work. Others turned their wit and beauty into bargaining chips, coaxing wealthier clients into offering small protections or favors. But survival always had a cost paid in the erosion of the body, the hardening of the heart, and the slow erasure of the self. For Athens, this toll was easy to ignore. For the women living it, there was no escape. Illness might take them quickly or slowly grind them down, but the outcome was the same. Their suffering stayed hidden, and the city's golden image remained untarnished. By daylight, Athens carried itself like the guardian of morality and virtue. Public speeches thundered against vice, and laws drew rigid boundaries between the respectable and the fallen. Men in the assembly would speak as if the city's survival depended on guarding its youth from the corrupting touch of these women. But when night fell, the lines blurred into shadows. The same men who had condemned the brothels in public could be found in their perfumed chambers whispering honeyed lies to the very women they scorned. It was a double life that everyone knew existed, yet no one dared to name aloud. This was the hypocrisy at the heart of Athens. The city relied on the bodies of these women to satisfy desire to keep peace in marriages, even to inspire poetry and art, yet it refused to grant them any dignity for it. They were vessels, not citizens, a need to be hidden in daylight but sought after in darkness. Wives, too, played their silent role in this arrangement. Many knew their husbands visited brothels, yet they were powerless to confront them without risking their own security. The quiet tolerance in private homes was not born of acceptance. It was born of survival in a society where a woman's position depended entirely on her husband's favor. For the workers themselves, this duplicity could be a dangerous game. A favored lover could shower a woman with gifts, protection, even political influence, but that same man could turn cold overnight, and his public condemnation could destroy her livelihood in an instant. And so the women learned to master the art of balancing on this razor's edge. They listened more than they spoke. They learned to flatter without becoming attached, to offer pleasure while guarding their own truths. In a city of philosophers, they became philosophers of survival, thinking 3 steps ahead in a game they could never openly admit they were playing. Athens thrived on this contradiction, and for the women trapped in it, navigating that contradiction was the only way to stay alive. In Athens, beauty was both a weapon and a curse. For the women who sold pleasure, their youth was the currency that kept them alive. Every glance from a wealthy patron, every whispered promise over a cup of wine, was a transaction rooted in the fragile illusion of eternal allure. But time was a predator they could not escape. Wrinkles formed quietly at the edges of painted smiles, the brightness of their eyes dimmed after years of late nights, and the strength in their voices wavered after too many bargains struck in desperation. Clients who once swore devotion would drift to younger faces without a backward glance. For some, the solution was to retire early if they had the fortune to find a patron willing to support them indefinitely. But such arrangements were rare and often came with chains of their own, a life confined to a man's household, stripped of independence, traded for comfort that could vanish if his affection cooled. Others clung to survival in the only way they knew, lowering their prices, accepting harsher treatment, moving from elite symposia to dingy street corners where laughter was replaced with fear. The downward spiral was swift and merciless. A few reinvented themselves as madams running houses and training younger women in the arts of seduction and survival. Yet even this path was fraught with danger, for the city could shut down a brothel overnight, and rivals could destroy a reputation with a single rumor. And then there were the forgotten ones, the women who slipped into anonymity, no longer desirable to patrons too proud or too broken to beg. They became beggars, washerwomen, or vanished entirely, their names erased from the city that once consumed their beauty with such hunger. This was the unspoken truth in Athens. A woman's body was her stage, but the play had an unforgiving end. When the curtain fell, there were no applause, no second acts, only silence, and the shadow of a life spent in the service of a city that would never claim her as its own. Athens was a city obsessed with memory. Statues of heroes lined its streets, marble inscriptions carved the names of victorious generals, and epic poets immortalized the deeds of statesmen, in verses meant to echo for centuries. But for the women whose bodies had fueled its private pleasures and financed its public spectacles, there was no such remembrance. Their names were whispered in the moment, sung at drunken banquets, scribbled in crude graffiti on tavern walls, but never etched into the stone of public record. Even the most famous courtesans, the hetairai who had conversed with philosophers and influenced politics from behind silken curtains, existed in history only as shadows framed by the men who once desired them. When they died, there were no public funerals, no solemn processions. At best, a small group of loyal friends might gather to lay them to rest quietly, their graves marked by nothing more than a rough stone or a memory fading in the minds of those who had known them. Yet in the cracks of the city's grand narrative, traces of them lingered. In the private collections of the wealthy, painted vases still bore the delicate silhouettes of dancers and lovers. In the fragments of letters and plays, there were lines hinting at the wit, beauty, and cunning of women who navigated the most treacherous of social terrains. And in a way, their legacy lived not in Athens' proud monuments, but in the invisible threads they wove through its society: alliances brokered in whispered conversations, rivalries ignited over their favor, decisions made in the haze of passion that would ripple into the political life of the polis. This was their paradoxical immortality, erased from official history, yet still shaping it from the shadows. Their absence from the marble friezes did not mean they had no power. It meant their power was too intimate, too dangerous to be acknowledged in daylight. In the end, the women of Athens' pleasure trade were both ghosts and architects of their time, forgotten by the city's historians, but forever etched in the undercurrent of the city's soul.